I would have done it much differently. I actually told Theresa May how to do it, but she didn't agree with it. She didn't listen to me.
What did you say?
She didn't listen. No, I told her how to do it. That will be up to her to say. But I told her how to do it. She wanted to go a different route.
So you would be prepared to walk away if they didn't give you the right terms?
Oh, absolutely. I think what's going on is very unfortunate. I did give Theresa, who I like, I did give her my views on what she should do and how she should negotiate. And she didn't follow those views. I would actually say she probably went the opposite way. I think the deal that she's striking is not what the people voted on. It's a much different deal than the people voted on. It was not the deal that was in the referendum. I know they have a lot of resignations, so a lot of people don't like it. No, but it'll definitely affect trade with the United States, unfortunately in a negative way. If they do a deal like that, it will most likely, because we'll be dealing with the European Union instead of dealing with the UK. So it will probably kill the deal with, if they do that, their trade deal with the US will probably not be made. No, if they do that, I would say that would probably end a major trade relationship with the United States.
Those are portions of President Trump's interview with The Sun, criticizing Prime Minister Theresa May's Brexit strategy, among other things. The two leaders are set to answer questions side by side in just a little while. We will be going to that live. A lot happened here symbolically, Katty Kay, including who the president chose to go visit first.
Yes. I mean, the fact that he had this very glamorous dinner last night that was laid on for him in London, outside London, and this was the offering that Theresa May gave him. You can see the pictures there. It was magical. The lighting was beautiful. Everyone looked incredible. And it was halfway through this dinner with Theresa May and 150 British business leaders that we got news of this interview. You can't imagine how the rest of that dinner turned out. This is worse than just going to dinner, however, and insulting your host while you're there. Theresa May's government, her leadership hangs in the balance this week in the UK over this Brexit plan. And Donald Trump has just taken a bulldozer and driven straight through that plan and potentially straight through the Prime Minister's leadership. At the moment, they're having this meeting at her country residence. He was just asked whether he regretted that interview in the Sun newspaper, and he just looked away, apparently rather awkwardly. We understand they're going to give a press conference, and he will try to reframe some of those remarks, but make no mistake, he could not have said something more damaging to Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, at a more sensitive moment.
All right, David Ignatius, your thoughts?
Well, like Katty, I think this is just remarkably undiplomatic diplomacy. One of the British papers, I think it was the Daily Mirror, headlined, "The ego has landed" when he got to Britain. And to see all this entirely in terms of his own negotiating skill, I thought that was the part of the interview I found most amazing. Well, I wouldn't have done it that way. I tried to tell her how to do it, but she didn't listen to me. It was almost as if he was going to punish her for not following his tutelage, and eager to show that he knows how to negotiate, other people don't. It just illustrates what an isolated position the United States has these days, estranged from the European Union, traditionally key allies, estranged from Great Britain, traditionally our closest ally. The president arrives and is met with demonstrators. The president arrives with a dagger. He stabbed Theresa May not in the back, in the front. On arrival, and it's just extraordinary. Whether her government can survive, as Katty suggested, is a real question.
Their joint news conference will be fascinating. We'll be looking forward to that during the show today. But Heidi, he had a lot to say.
He did. And wait, there is actually more. The president also addressed immigration, taking aim at his host country and the wider continent.
I think what's happened to Europe is a shame. I think the allowing the immigration to take place in Europe is a shame. I think it changed the fabric of Europe. And unless you act very quickly, it's never going to be what it was. And I don't mean that in a positive way. So I think allowing millions and millions of people to come in to Europe is very, very sad. I think you're losing your culture.
Brett, you know, sometimes we try and analyze why he's doing what he's doing. And sometimes I think it comes down to something simple. And I've dealt with CEOs like this, that before you show up, whatever was there was broken. And that in order to feed yourself, and you come off of NATO, just because it's inarguable why we have NATO. I mean, it's common sense for even a first-year political science student. But that the level of, he doesn't exist in his mind unless it was this way, now it's this way because I'm here. It was that way, regardless of the destruction. And it is a modus operandus, if you watch his approach to everything, he can only feel alive if he destroys,
right,
and then somehow is the center of things, regardless of what is going on. And I think that just simply is what drives it. Beyond any policy issue, it's this human tick, this inability to understand what's in front of him other than how can I supersede whatever is going on or whatever came before me.
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln, in one of his first great speeches, said that the problem with democracy is that after a generation of builders, you get a generation of destroyers who seek the gratification of their egos in tearing things up rather than stitching them together or building them up. He was, of course, anticipating the Confederacy. And in a sense, there's something about that psychology with Donald Trump as well. I think there's also an ideology at play. This is a guy who hates all forms of immigration. What he was saying with respect to European immigration is not so different than what he is saying with respect to American immigration. But there's another point, which is this is a guy who has taken as his mantra, America first. That is the mantra of the isolationists before World War II. And what we're quickly discovering is that America first also means America alone, and very quickly means America hated. And I don't think it has dawned on this president, or ever will dawn on this president, how short the road is between America first and America hated. We have never been so despised, and I can think back to George W. Bush administration, the Reagan administration, even going back to the Vietnam War. We have never been so despised by the people who ought to be our allies as we are today. And the saddest thing to say is, as an American and as someone who loves this country, is it's very hard to offer my European friends, my European wife, any excuses for the behavior of this government toward the very people who have stood with us through thick and thin for over 100 years.
So you can just take like the past 10 hours of news and encapsulate why you said exactly what you said. You've got the scorched earth at the NATO summit literally going out the door, with the president's comments in a news conference being undermined directly and called untrue because they were. By the president of France, saying that did not happen, Mr. President, as we had to fact check his news conference in real time because so many things he said, even about his own election win, were wrong. That happened at the end of the NATO summit, which did not seem to go too well for our allies. Rudeness and insults as he heads to Britain, as he lands, and who he goes to talk to. What is Britain's prime minister supposed to do at this point as he insults her, undermines her, and gets ready to do a press conference with her, which we will be taking live here on Morning Joe? All the while that this is happening, you have Republicans on Capitol Hill abusing, harassing, haranguing, and desperately pulling at the air for some sort of answer that might perhaps back up their point that this guy is not a patriot, that this FBI agent was not doing his job, that somehow the FBI agent was in some way leaning toward one candidate or the other, or wasn't being an American in his duties. And then you saw the FBI agent speaking for himself. Anybody who watched that, listened to him, because he was the only one who could really finish a sentence in a coherent way. And all you could hear was a man who loves America, who made mistakes, who is now being abused by a bunch of stuttering, bumbling Republicans on Capitol Hill because they have their base watching, and they know they need to throw red meat out to their base using this guy as their victim to get there. That's what America looks like today. Let's bring in the co-founder of Axios, Mike Allen. Mike, you have more on the president's trip. What do you got?
Yeah, Mika, we're calling this the Trump tornado, the worst guess. The pound is falling this morning, and as you just suggested, her government could fall over this. And Mika, the irony of this is that the Brits had planned this trip for him as a layup. They'd set up these great pictures that we're seeing here, kept him outside of London, kept him away from the baby blimp, baby Trump blimp with its diapers, and trying to make this little respite ahead of his summit with Putin. Instead, we see the president who's just saying what's on his mind, thinking about his base, not considering the consequences for her. And the Sun, the Rupert Murdoch paper, largest paper in Britain, saying this pours nitroglycerin on the situation there. And important thing to remember, Mika, is that Brexit is the most sensitive issue he could have hit her on.
Yeah.
There would have been no way to do more damage.
Wonderful. Mike Hallen, thank you so much. And still ahead, Jared Kushner was granted a permanent security clearance back in May, but apparently he still doesn't have access to the nation's most sensitive intelligence. That's a good thing, right? The Washington Post's Carol Leonnig joins us with her latest reporting. And we'll bring back in Matt Miller and Jeremy Bash with more on the explosive, very tense testimony on Capitol Hill. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.